Clara felt the sun burning her skin as she stood tied up in the middle of the scorched stone plaza. The ropes were tight around her wrists, her eyes cast downward to avoid the stares of a bunch of people who looked at her with not an ounce of pity. The girl, 22 years old, brown hair and a face dirty with dust, was no longer a person, just a piece of inheritance left by a rich man who died a few weeks ago, now being auctioned off as if she were just another object. The judge, a scruffy man with a hoarse voice, presented her as an asset for public sale. His black robe flapped in the hot wind that stirred the dust of the plaza. Nobody dared raise their hand or offer even $1. The silence of the people of Scorched Rock became complicit in the humiliation Clarita was facing. The soft murmurs echoed, as if they were judging her without giving her a chance to defend herself. The girl, barefoot on the burning ground, closed her eyes, wishing the earth would swallow her so this nightmare would end. The plaza of Scorched Rock, surrounded by adobe houses and a cantina half falling apart, was the heart of that forgotten town, where law was made by whoever had more money or power. The man who owned Clara, a landowner named Don Esteban, had died of a fever, leaving a will that listed the girl as part of his property, along with land and cattle. The judge, following the orders of the document, arranged the public auction, and Clarita, who had worked in Esteban's house since she was 15, was dragged to the center of town without the right to speak. "Who will give more for this hard-working girl?" shouted the man in the robe, his voice echoing through the dusty streets. But the people, men in hats, women with baskets, kids with dirty feet, remained silent. Some lowered their heads, others looked at her with pity. Clara, tears streaming down her face, knew no one there was going to save her, that her life was worth less than a horse in that place. The midday heat made the air heavy, and sweat ran down Clara's forehead as she tried to breathe calmly, her wrists aching beneath the rough ropes that tied her to a wooden post. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps on dry earth broke the silence, coming from the shadow of the cantina across the plaza, a crooked building with wooden doors that creaked in the wind. A tall man with a black hat and his face half hidden under the brim stepped out slowly, the dust rising around his worn boots, the gray cloak fluttering as he passed through the crowd that parted to let him through. It was Tomas del Rio, a cowboy few knew, a stranger who would show up now and then in Scorched Rock to buy things and then disappear. He stood in front of the judge, his dark eyes locked on the tied-up girl, and without saying a word he tossed a silver coin to the ground, the sound of metal against the earth echoing like thunder. The judge picked up the coin from the ground, frowning as he examined it, and turned to look at Tomas with distrust, his voice full of contempt as he asked, "That's all she's worth to you?" Tom, as some in town called him, didn't answer, just took a step forward and pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming and making people step back with a murmur of surprise. Clara opened her eyes, her heart pounding hard as she saw the man approach, but instead of fear, she felt something she couldn't explain when he cut the ropes that bound her with a quick and precise pull. "She's coming with me," he finally said, his deep voice low, almost a whisper, as he sheathed the knife and offered his hand to help her stand. The girl, still trembling, accepted the help, her feet wobbling on the earth, and for the first time in hours she breathed without the weight of the ropes. The crowd began to murmur louder, some gossiping about the stranger, others angry that someone would buy the girl with just a coin, but no one dared to interfere, not even the judge, who tucked the money into his pocket with a grunt. Thomas, without looking back, began to walk toward the edge of the plaza, and Clara, still dazed, followed him, her bare feet stepping on the burning ground as she tried to understand what was happening. He didn't treat her like property. There was no arrogance in his movements, just a silence that seemed to carry intentions she couldn't decipher. When they passed the cantina, Tom stopped for a moment, grabbing a blanket hanging on the fence and handing it to Clarita, who took it with a timid gesture. Without another word, the two fled Scorched Rock, the blazing sun overhead marking the beginning of a path Clara didn't know where it would lead. As they left town, Clara looked at the cowboy's broad back, his gray cloak fluttering in the wind, and tried to muster the courage to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, drowned by a mix of relief and the unknown. Tomas, for his part, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the desert opened up like a sea of sand and stone. The horse he had tied at the entrance to Scorched Rock neighed when he saw him. He climbed up onto the animal easily, extending his hand to Clara so she could mount behind him, and she, hesitating slightly, accepted, grabbing onto his waist as the horse began to trot. The girl had no idea where they were going or why this man had taken her from the plaza, but for the first time in years she felt that the future, although uncertain, was no longer a rope tied around her wrists. The desert ahead, with its golden dunes and endless sky, seemed to whisper promises she didn't yet understand. Clara held tightly to Tomas's waist as the horse galloped away from Scorched Rock, the hot desert wind hitting her face, carrying off the dust that clung to the blanket he had given her. The girl, still dazed from the auction, felt her body aching from the ropes that had bound her, but the animal's steady rhythm beneath her bare feet brought a new sensation, almost like freedom, even if it wasn't quite comfortable. Tom, the cowboy in the black hat and grey cloak, kept his gaze locked forward, the reins steady in his weathered hands, the silence between them heavier than the dry air around them. The sun began to set, painting the horizon orange, and Clarita, squinting at the light, realized this stranger was not like the other men from Scorched Rock. He had saved her without asking for anything in return, a mystery that intrigued her deeply. The promise of freedom he whispered when he cut her ropes echoed in her mind as the desert unfolded before them. The horse trotted steadily across the sand, leaving behind the last crooked adobe houses that marked the edge of Scorched Rock, and Clara felt the weight of the past fading with each step, though not knowing what was coming made her clutch the blanket tighter against her chest. Tom didn't speak, his face half hidden under the brim of his hat, but his broad shoulders and calm movements gave the girl a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years, not since she was forced to work at Don Esteban's house. The desert around them, with its dunes shaped by the wind and dry bushes scattered across the ground, seemed endless, a landscape that cut them off from the world she had just escaped. Clarita, looking at the cowboy's back, noticed some scars peeking through his torn shirt, marks of a hard life he carried silently, and she wondered who this man really was, who had taken her from the plaza for a single coin, a knife. Night fell suddenly, the sky filling with stars that sparkled like lanterns over the vastness, and Tomas led the horse to a large rock that offered a bit of shade, dismounting smoothly before helping Clara down. The girl, her legs trembling, leaned on the stone, feeling its coldness against her hands, while Tom untied the saddlebags, pulling out a bottle of water and a piece of hard bread that he broke in half without a word. "Here," he murmured in his hoarse voice, breaking the silence, and Clarita, hungry, accepted the piece, biting into it carefully as she watched him. He sat a few steps away, leaning against the rock, his eyes fixed on the stars, and for the first time the girl noticed a distant glow in his gaze, as if he carried memories he couldn't let go of. The promise of freedom sealed with that simple gesture felt more real under the pale light of the moon. Clara finished the bread and took a sip of water, feeling her throat ease, but the silence between them remained heavy, almost tangible, as if both were waiting for the other to break the unseen barrier. Tom lit a small fire with some dry sticks he found nearby, the flames dancing in the darkness, and Clarita moved closer to the heat, wrapping herself in the blanket while watching him prepare a canteen to heat something that smelled like coffee. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper cutting through the desert calm. He paused for a moment, his hands still over the canteen, before answering, "No one else was going to." The short, direct words carried a weight Clara couldn't quite decipher, but something in them made her feel this mysterious cowboy had more to offer than just a rescue. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rocks, and Clara, warmed by the flame and the blanket, let her eyes close for a moment, tired from the journey and the emotions of the day. Tom, for his part, kept watch through the night, his hat still on, the knife within reach on his belt as if expecting something or someone to come from the dark horizon. Before falling asleep, the girl looked at him one last time, noticing how tense he was, and wondered if the silence between them was just the beginning of something bigger, an unspoken agreement that bound them. Beyond the desert, the wind blew gently, bringing the scent of dry earth, and Clarita dreamed of the plaza's post, but this time the ropes fell away on their own, cut by hands she couldn't see, leading her to a place where humiliation couldn't reach her. The cowboy by the fire kept his gaze steady, knowing that the road ahead would be as tough as the sand beneath his boots. With the morning creeping in, the sky began to lighten from the east, and Tomas put out the embers with the tip of his boot, packing up the few things before telling Clara it was time to move on. The girl woke up to the sound of his voice, her eyes still heavy, but she got up, feeling her body less sore, as if the brief rest had given her strength. He helped her back onto the horse, mounting afterward, and the animal began to trot again, taking them deeper into the desert. Clara, with the blanket around her shoulders, looked at the horizon where the dunes blended with the sky, and felt that this journey, though quiet, marked a change from a life of slavery to something she still couldn't name. Tom rode ahead with determination, and the unspoken bond between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing kilometer. Clara held tightly to the blanket as the horse moved through the desert, the midday sun turning the dunes into mirrors of light that burned her eyes, the hot sand blowing into her face. The girl, her bare feet dangling from the side of the horse, felt the heat toasting her skin, but Tom's steady pace kept her focused as if each step took her farther from Scorched Rock. The cowboy, his black hat tilted to shield his face, guided the horse with firm hands, the silence between them still heavy, but filled with an agreement that didn't need words. Clarita, looking at the horizon where the sky merged with the sand, realized that the desert was not just a void, it was a symbol of change, pain, and possibilities that she was beginning to glimpse. Each kilometer they passed seemed to peel away a piece of the hell she left behind in the plaza, but the future, still hazy, left a hollow feeling she couldn't explain. The arid land stretched endlessly, with dunes rising and falling like waves of a golden sea, and the horse, whom Tom called Sombra, moved forward with a resilience that seemed to reflect the cowboy's grit. Clara, seated behind, felt her body sway with the animal's rhythm, her leg muscles aching from the unfamiliar movement, but she didn't complain, afraid that any word might break the fragile balance between them. The sun, now high overhead, made the air almost impossible to breathe, and she noticed Tom's canteen was nearly dry, the last drop of water falling onto the sand as he tucked it back into the saddlebag. "We'll stop over there," he murmured, pointing to a cluster of rocks that offered a bit of shade, the first bit of relief Clarita had seen since they set out at dawn. They dismounted under the rocks, and Clara sat in the shade, folding the blanket beneath her to shield herself from the hot stone, while Tom tied Sombra to a dry bush that barely withstood the wind. He pulled a small shovel from the saddlebag and began to dig near the rock, his movements precise, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for, until a thread of water began to trickle from the ground, dirty at first, but gradually clearing. "Here," he said, filling the canteen and handing it to Clarita, who accepted it with a nod, the cool water easing her parched throat as she watched him work in silence. The cowboy, his grey cloak now hung on the rock, seemed to know the desert like the back of his hand, and the girl began to realize that her survival depended on this man's experience. Sitting there, holding the canteen, she understood he wasn't just a stranger, he was a guide leading her far from the past. The rest was brief, and then Tom signaled it was time to go, helping her back onto the horse before mounting himself, his hat snug against the setting sun. The journey continued, and the desert, its colors shifting from golden to shades of red and purple at dusk, seemed to speak to Clara in a way she had never felt before, as if each dune carried a story of struggle and rebirth. The girl, still not speaking much, began to observe the cowboy more, noticing how he held the reins, how alert he was, and how the knife never left his belt, as if he were expecting danger hidden in the sand. "Have you crossed this place before?" she asked, her voice hesitant, breaking the silence for the first time since the break. Tom turned his face slightly, his gaze distant, and replied, "Many times, but it's never the same journey." Night came, and the desert cold replaced the heat, making Clara wrap the blanket tighter around herself as Sombra slowed to a gentler trot. To save energy, Tom chose a spot between two dunes where the wind formed a natural barrier and set up a small camp with a fire and a tarp stretched out on the ground for them to sleep. He divided another piece of hard bread with Clarita, and this time he sat closer to her, the warmth of the fire heating them as the sky filled with stars. The girl, watching the flames, felt that the silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge, an understanding that didn't need words. "So you don't talk much, do you?" she said, trying a timid smile, and Tom for the first time gave a slight nod. "I speak when it's needed." As she slept, wrapped in the blanket beside the fire, Clara dreamed of scorched rock, but this time she wasn't tied to the post. She was running, her bare feet in the sand, and the wind seemed to push her forward, as if the desert were carrying her to someplace new. Tom, awake beside her, watched the night, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon, knowing the journey was far from over, and that Clarita's past, like his own, might not be left behind so easily as the sand they left in their wake. The horse, tied a few meters away, neighed softly, and the cowboy gripped the knife on his belt, feeling that the desert, with all its vastness, held more than promises. It held dangers he knew well. Clarita's journey, which began with cut ropes, had now become something greater, a path she traveled without knowing the destination, but with the certainty that she was no longer alone. Clara spotted the cabin from afar, a crooked structure of wood and adobe emerging between the dunes. The roof was all broken, and the walls marked by time, while Tomas's horse slowed its pace under the sun already setting on the horizon. The girl, wrapped in the blanket around her shoulders, felt her feet toughened after days crossing the desert, but seeing that shelter, even though it looked run down, brought her an unexpected sense of relief. Tom, his grey cloak all dusty, dismounted from Sombra with a fluid movement, tying the animal to a dry trunk next to the small house, his gaze sharp as if checking every corner of the place. Clarita dismounted next, her legs still weak, and stood watching the building that looked abandoned for years, its windows without glass, letting the wind whistle through inside. The cowboy, without saying a word, started walking toward the door, and she followed him, feeling that this place, no matter how broken it looked, could be a new beginning. The cabin, Tom seemed to know, was small, with a single room that smelled of damp wood and earth, the floor covered in dust and cobwebs hanging from the corners like forgotten curtains. Clara stayed near the entrance, hesitant, while the cowboy opened a saddlebag and pulled out simple tools, a hammer, nails, a piece of tarp that he began to use to cover a hole in the roof. "Have you been here before?" she asked, her voice timid as she watched him repair a beam with well-placed blows, sweat running down his forehead beneath his hat. He paused for a moment, his eyes on the wood, before answering, "Sometimes it's just a place to stop." Clarita, still unsure, realized that his silence wasn't rude, just habit, and decided to help, picking up an old rag she found on the floor to clean a broken table, feeling that the task, small as it was, gave her a purpose she hadn't had since scorched rock. The day passed quickly, and the night brought a cold that made Clara wrap herself tighter in the blanket, while Tom lit a fire inside the cabin, using old boards he pulled from a wall that no longer served. The flames lit up the room, revealing details the girl hadn't noticed before: an old iron stove, a chair with no seat, a faded drawing on the wall, maybe made by someone who lived there long ago. Clarita, sitting close to the fire, watched the cowboy patch a window, covering it with the tarp to block the wind, and for the first time felt that this space, though simple, was a refuge, a place where she didn't have to hide. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, pointing at his work, and Tom, without taking his eyes off the tarp, replied, "So we have somewhere to stay." The response, as direct as always, made the girl feel a warmth that didn't come just from the fire. As the night wore on, Clara began to explore the room, finding a rusty metal box under the table, which she opened carefully, discovering a needle, thread, and a piece of cloth that looked like an old bandana. She took the items and began mending a tear in the blanket, her fingers working slowly, but with skill she had learned in Don Esteban's house, where she used to sew clothes for the family. Tom, seeing what she was doing, paused for a moment and watched her, her face lit by the fire, and Clarita, feeling his gaze, looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time without turning away. There was no judgment there, just quiet curiosity, and the girl realized that even without words, they were beginning to share the space in a way that didn't demand anything. The sound of the needle passing through the fabric mixed with the crackling of the fire, forming a kind of harmony that seemed to seal the shelter. Before sleeping, Tom spread a tarp on the floor for Clara, placing it near the fire while he leaned against the opposite wall, his knife within reach as always, his hat covering part of his face. As she lay down, the girl looked up at the crooked roof where the firelight danced and thought about how that place, which looked so fragile, made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: safety, even if it was temporary. The cowboy, for his part, stayed alert, listening to the wind whistling outside, knowing the desert wasn't the only danger they might face. The cabin, now a little more livable, had become a pause in their journey, a space where Clarita began to see the possibility of a new beginning, even if she still didn't fully trust Tom. The silence between them, now lighter, seemed to be the first step towards something neither of them could name. The next day, Clara woke up to the sound of hammering, and when she opened her eyes, she saw Tom fixing the cabin door, reinforcing it with a wooden plank he had found nearby. The girl got up, folding the tarp she had slept on, and approached hesitantly, asking if she could help, to which he replied with a nod, handing her an improvised broom to sweep the floor. Together, they worked in silence, slowly transforming the shelter, and Clarita, as she swept the dust, felt that each movement was a way of erasing the marks of the past, even if she still didn't fully trust the cowboy. The sun rose in the sky, illuminating the interior of the cabin, and the girl smiled for the first time as she looked at the space that was beginning to look like a home, even if only temporary. Tom, noticing the smile, paused for a moment, and something in his gaze changed, as if he too was starting to see that place as more than just a stop along the road. Clara woke up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the cabin, the sun's rays slipping through the cracks in the tarp on the window, and the soft neighing of Sombra outside breaking the silence of the previous night. The girl, still wrapped in the mended blanket, felt her body less sore, as if the rest in that crooked little house had brought a relief she didn't expect. The dirt floor now clean thanks to the previous day's work. Tom, with his sleeves rolled up, stirred a pot over an improvised fire, the grey cloak hanging on a wooden hook he had fixed, the hat resting nearby like a silent guardian. Clarita got up, folded the tarp carefully, and approached the fire, noticing a small plate of dried fruit he had left close by, a small detail that made her hesitate before accepting it. The cowboy, without looking at her, simply said, "Take it, you'll need it." and she, with a nod, felt that that act was beginning to build something between them. The day unfolded with a routine slowly taking shape, and Clara noticed that Tom left early to gather firewood, returning with his arms full of dry sticks which he piled near the door, while she used the needle and thread from the box to mend an old curtain she found in a corner. He cut the wood with an improvised axe, the blows ringing through the cabin, and the girl watched him trying to pick up on his rhythm, the way he worked, without hurry, but with determination. In the afternoon, when the sun hit hard outside, Tom brought water from a well he had discovered a few hundred meters away, filling a bucket that he left by the fire, and Clarita, without being asked, began to boil the water to clean the floor more thoroughly. The glances they exchanged, although brief, weren't judgmental. They were like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together, building a trust that didn't need words. The next night, while they shared a broth made with roots Tom had dug from the sandy earth, Clara decided to break the silence. The spoon paused in her hand as she looked at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice low, almost swallowed by the crackling fire. Tom, who until then had been looking at his plate, raised his head, the firelight illuminating his face, and after a pause replied, "No one else would have." The response, short and direct, carried a sincerity that made a lump form in the girl's throat, and she realized that behind his silence was a story of companionship he didn't talk about. Clarita nodded, returning to her meal, and the bond between them, still subtle, began to grow like a sprout blooming in dry soil, fed by small but constant gestures. The cowboy, seeing that Clarita was adapting to the shelter, began to leave her tasks like organizing the tools or lighting the fire, and she, though inexperienced, learned quickly, feeling that each thing integrated her more into that space. One afternoon, while patching a crack in the wall with mud he had brought, Tom approached with a piece of rope, teaching her how to make a simple knot to tie the window top, his hands guiding hers with patience. The girl, feeling the warmth of his rough hand against hers, realized that this touch, brief as it was a sign of respect, something she had never been given in Don Esteban's house. The bond, still fragile, grew stronger with each exchange, and Clarita began to see Tom not as a distant savior, but as a man who shared the weight of that crooked shelter. Before bed, Clara stared at the roof where the firelight cast shadows that danced like ghosts and thought about Tom's answer. No one else would have, feeling that those words carried more than just a reason, perhaps an old guilt or a long-forgotten promise. Tom, leaning against the opposite wall, watched the night, the knife close by, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting something beyond the whistling wind outside. The girl, lying on the tarp, closed her eyes, dreaming of the desert, but this time it wasn't an enemy. It was a road she traveled beside someone, the silence between them becoming something solid. The cowboy, awake, listened to her breathing slow and for a moment relaxed, knowing that the shelter, although crooked, was becoming a home for the two of them. The next day, Clara woke to the sound of Sombra grazing outside, and when she got up, she saw that Tom had left a small cup of hot coffee beside the tarp, a detail that made her smile for the first time in days. She approached the fire where he was chopping wood and asked if she could help prepare something for lunch, to which he responded with a nod, handing her a knife to cut roots. Together they worked in harmony, the sound of the knife mixing with the chopping of wood, and Clarita felt that this bond, though new, was like a seed sprouting in the desert's dry soil, promising something neither of them dared name. The sun climbed high, heating the cabin, and the girl watching Tom realized that the silence between them was no longer a barrier, but the beginning of a companionship that would take them beyond that crooked refuge. Clara woke up to a strange sound, a dry creak that wasn't the wind or the fire, the first rays of sunlight slipping through the slits of the tarp on the crooked cabin window. The girl, still wrapped in the mended blanket, got up slowly, her heart pounding hard when she saw Tom already on his feet, the knife in his hand, his eyes fixed on the half-open door. Sombra, tied outside, neighed softly, a warning that made Clarita move closer to the window, peeking through the tarp and spotting fresh footprints in the sand, marked by boots that didn't belong to the cowboy. Tom signaled her to stay quiet, moving silently toward the door, his grey cloak fluttering as he checked the area, and the girl, with a chill running down her spine, knew that the past from scorched rock might be coming back to haunt her. The refuge that had started to feel like home now felt like a trap about to snap shut. The footprints led east, where the desert opened into a narrow valley, and Tomas, still gripping the knife, went to investigate, returning minutes later with a harder expression, confirming that unknown horses had passed by. Clarita, sitting beside the extinguished fire, clutched the now cold coffee cup, her fingers trembling as he explained aloud, "There are several. They're coming for you." The girl, remembering the auction and Don Esteban's claim, felt the weight of those words, realizing that someone from scorched rock might have sent men to reclaim her like a lost object. Tom grabbed the axe and began reinforcing the door, hammering an extra beam in place while she helped hand him nails with shaking hands, the sound of the hammer echoing like a war drum, the bond between them now facing its first test. Hours later, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, and Clara ran to the window, seeing a cloud of dust approaching, led by a man in a dark uniform riding a black horse, a sheriff with a scar on his face and a badge gleaming in the sun. Behind him rode 3 others, rifles in hand, their eyes scanning the desert until they fixed on the cabin. "Come out, girl!" shouted the officer, his sharp voice cutting through the dry air. "You're part of Don Esteban's inheritance, and I came to collect you by order of the judge." Clarita, hidden behind the tarp, felt fear return, but also a surge of anger, and looked at Tom, who placed himself between the door and her, the knife replaced by a revolver he pulled from the saddlebag. "She's not property," he said, his voice firm, standing as a shield between the girl and the threat closing in. The sheriff dismounted, walking toward the cabin with the men behind him, his rifle raised, demanding Tom hand over Clara, threatening to burn the place down if he didn't comply. The girl, trembling, grabbed the needle she had used to mend the blanket, feeling it like a tiny weapon as the cowboy stayed calm, his eyes locked on the officer. "You won't touch her," Tom replied, the revolver steady in his hand, and the silence that followed was broken by the click of guns being cocked. Clarita, hidden, realized she couldn't rely on him alone and began to plan, remembering a gap at the back of the cabin that he had covered with a tarp, a possible escape or a trap. The bond between them, now tested by danger, made her want to fight, not just be rescued. The tension mounted and the sheriff stepped forward, ordering his men to surround the cabin, while Tom retreated inside, closing the reinforced door. Clara, moving quickly, whispered, "I can distract them. There's an exit in the back." Tom nodded, handing her a small machete from his belt, his eyes saying more than words, and the girl, her heart in her throat, crawled toward the gap, feeling the sand under her knees. Outside, the officer barked commands, and she took advantage of the moment by throwing a rock at a distant boulder, the noise diverting the men's attention. The cowboy, seeing the distraction, prepared for the fight, knowing the real trouble was only just beginning, and Clarita, for the first time, felt that the crooked refuge was more than a hiding place. It was the place where she would decide her fate. Clara crawled out through the back opening of the cabin, the rough sand scraping her knees as the sound of hooves and the sheriff's shouts echoed on the other side. Her heart pounded like a drum in the desert gloom. The young woman, holding the small machete firmly in her hand, felt the afternoon sun burning the back of her neck, but the plan she had formed in her mind kept her focused, her eyes searching for a large rock a few meters away that could serve as cover. Tom, inside the cracked shelter, positioned himself behind the reinforced door, revolver ready, ears tuned to the approaching steps, while the officer's men circled the place, their weapons clinking like a war signal. Clara, hidden behind the rock, saw 2 of the thugs separate to flank the cabin and knew it was her moment to act. The bond with the cowboy was no longer just refuge, it was a reason to fight, not just survive. The sheriff, his scar shining with sweat, slammed the door with the butt of his rifle, demanding that Tom hand over Clara, his voice slicing through the dry air. "Last chance, stranger. Give us the girl or we'll set this place ablaze," he shouted, striking a match he held close to a dry branch, the smell of sulfur mixing with the wind. Tom, without replying, opened a crack in the door and fired, hitting one of the men in the shoulder, who collapsed to the ground with a scream. The others pulled back, startled. Clara, taking advantage of the confusion, threw a stone toward a distant dune. The noise diverted the second thug, who ran to investigate, leaving the sheriff briefly alone. The girl, machete raised, crept behind him, her heart pounding, ready for the first fight of her life. The thug, now near the dune, turned too late. Clara, with a clumsy but determined motion, stabbed him in the leg. The man screamed and fell, his rifle slipping from his hands. She stumbled back, panting, the blood on the blade making her hands tremble, but the sound of gunfire inside the cabin snapped her back to reality. She ran back to the opening just in time to see Tom grappling hand-to-hand with a third thug who had broken in through the shattered door. The cowboy, with a precise blow, knocked him down, immediately pointing his revolver at the sheriff, who was still approaching, match still lit. Clara, without thinking, picked up the fallen rifle and aimed it at the officer. Though her aim trembled, her gaze was firm. She shouted, "Drop it!" The officer, surprised by the turn, dropped the match onto the sand. The flame died before reaching the cabin. The gunfire stopped. The desert returned to silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of Clara and Tom, who looked at each other for the first time as equals. The officer, hands in the air, backed up to his horse, muttering threats before mounting and fleeing with the surviving men, leaving the wounded behind. Clara, still holding the rifle in her hands, felt that fear was giving way to an unfamiliar firmness. The weight of the weapon was a symbol of her new strength. Tom, wiping the sweat from his face, approached her, took the bloodied machete, and wiped it on his own shirt. "You did good." The young woman, her chest still heaving, replied, "I don't want to just be saved anymore, I want to fight." They dragged the wounded man inside and tied him up with the rope Tom had used to reinforce the door. Clara, though disgusted, helped stop the bleeding with a piece of torn blanket. The cowboy, watching over him, explained that the man might reveal who had sent them. Clara, sitting beside him, felt that the confrontation marked a before and after. She was no longer the servant tied up in the square. She was now someone who chose her own path. Night fell over the shelter, now marked by bullets and blood. The fire was rekindled to illuminate the prisoner's face, who, under pressure, began to speak of orders issued by a corrupt judge from Scorched Rock. Clara, listening, gripped the rifle tightly. She knew the threat wasn't over. Tom improvised a cell with broken boards and locked the thug inside. Then he turned to Clara, his eyes reflecting respect for the first time. "You led them into the trap," he said, pointing to the opening. "That saved us both." Clara, wiping the blood from her hands, nodded. She felt that the bond between them had grown stronger through shared struggle. They stayed up all night, he at the door, she with the rifle at her side, and the desert outside seemed quieter, as if it recognized the new strength born in that cabin. The wounded man groaned, but Clara, now a warrior, knew that the next step was to confront whoever was behind that hunt, and she was ready. Beside Tom, Clara looked at the rifle still in her hands, the weapon's weight now familiar, while the silence of the night enveloped the cracked cabin, broken only by the low snores of the thug tied to the makeshift planks. The young woman, her face stained with dust and sweat, felt her muscles tense from the confrontation. The bloodied machete lay beside her like a trophy of her new strength, and her green eyes shone with a determination that hadn't existed before. Tom, leaning against the reinforced door, cleaned the revolver with a rag, his hat set aside, the grey cloak draped over a broken chair. For a moment their eyes met, filled with a respect that needed no words. Sombra, outside, neighed softly, as if approving the calm that had finally taken hold. Tom, sitting near the rekindled fire, understood that the fear that had ruled her in Scorched Rock had given way to something solid. He took a deep breath. "I'm not going to run anymore," said Clara. Tom stopped cleaning his weapon, his dark eyes fixed on her, nodding slowly as if acknowledging the transformation he had witnessed during the fight. "You fought like someone who's done it before," he said in a hoarse voice, breaking the silence as he holstered the revolver. Clara, gripping the rifle more firmly, responded, "I didn't fight for myself before, now I do." The confession floated in the air, and the cowboy for the first time smiled faintly, a rare gesture that softened the hard lines of his face. He no longer saw a rescued girl, he saw a survivor. He approached the fire, tossed a dry branch into the flames, and said, "That's who we are. We survive because we choose to." The young woman, warming her hands, felt that those words sealed a deep understanding. They recognized each other for who they were beyond the desert. The prisoner, waking from the crackle of the fire, muttered something about the judge from Scorched Rock. Tom faced him and asked firmly, "Where are the rest of the officer's men?" The prisoner, his leg still bleeding under a torn rag, hesitated before confessing that the sheriff would return with reinforcements, sent by the same corrupt judge who still claimed Clara as part of Don Esteban's inheritance. Clara, hearing this, gripped the rifle. The rage ignited, but also a resolve. She wouldn't let the past drag her back. Tom, noticing her resolve, suggested preparing the cabin for a new defense. Together they began moving boards and stones, reinforcing the windows, creating barriers. The work brought them even closer together. The bond between them, tested in combat, now blossomed in companionship. Night advanced. Clara, sitting beside Tom near the fire, shared with him a piece of roasted root she had found in the saddlebag, a gesture that sealed the moment of equality. "You didn't have to pull me from that plaza," she said, breaking the silence. He, looking into the flames, replied, "And you didn't have to fight today, but we did." The simplicity of the exchange brought unexpected comfort, and the young woman for the first time felt she wasn't alone. She was no longer a fugitive, but someone walking beside another survivor. The cowboy, for his part, saw in Clara a strength that reminded him of his own, a resilience forged in pain. He knew that from that moment on, the journey would be shared, not imposed. Before bed, Tom stood watch, the knife within reach. Clara lay on the tarp, the rifle beside her, her eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling where shadows danced. She thought of the post in Scorched Rock, but this time she wasn't tied to it. She was free, next to someone who saw her as an equal. The cowboy, listening to her breathing steady, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The girl he had rescued was now an ally. The desert outside, with its whispering wind, seemed to witness the birth of something new, and the shelter, marked by bullets and blood, had become the stage for a recognition that prepared them for what was to come. Morning approached, bringing the promise of a future they would choose together. Clara woke up to the distant song of a bird, the morning sun filtering through the cracks in the cabin, warming the dirt floor where the tarp was laid out. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The young woman with the rifle beside her felt her body less tense after the night of vigilance. Her muscles still bore the marks of the fight, but a calm born from mutual recognition with Tom was etched on her face. The cowboy, already on his feet, stirred the coffee in a pot over the fire. His grey cloak hung on a hook, and the hat rested on the repaired table. Sombra grazed silently outside, the sound of his hooves on the sand soft as a melody. Clara got up, folded the tarp carefully, and approached the fire, accepting the cup he handed her, feeling that this simple ritual marked the beginning of a routine that was starting to make sense. The desert, once an enemy, now felt like a soothing song, an improvised home where she felt part of something. The following days brought a rhythm that established itself slowly. Clara began helping Tom reinforce the cabin, using broken planks to cover holes, while he hunted small rodents with his knife. Bringing back food she learned to cook on a rod improvised with a needle from the rusty box. The young woman mended torn clothes they had found in the saddlebags, giving them new life. The cowboy, in turn, taught her how to identify edible herbs growing between the rocks. The silence remained, but now it was comfortable, marked by glances and gestures, a nod when she offered him water, another when he left firewood within reach. Clara, washing her hands in the bucket, felt for the first time that she belonged in that place. The manual work erased the memories of the auction, replacing them with a growing sense of purpose. At night, they sat by the fire, sharing roasted roots or dried fruit. Clara began to tell stories she had heard at Don Esteban's house, and Tom listened with his eyes fixed on the flames, occasionally adding details from his own experiences, a journey through mountains, a night under the rain. Clara, laughing at one of his comments about a stubborn horse, realized that this sound, her laughter, was new, a sign that the fear was beginning to dissolve. Tom, noticing the laugh, made a gesture of approval. That exchange, however simple, sealed an alliance that went beyond survival. The wind that once howled as a threat now brought a comforting coolness, and the cabin, with its reinforced walls, had become a true refuge, a place where Clara's past couldn't reach her. One afternoon, while repairing the roof with dry mud, Clara asked about the future. Her shy voice broke the usual silence. "What comes after this?" Tom, pausing with the shovel in hand, looked toward the horizon and replied, "We'll see. For now, this is enough." The vague but sincere answer made Clara understand that there was no defined end, just a path they were building step by step. She took a bucket to fetch water from the well and returned to find Tom training Sombra to carry more weight. He included her in the process, calling her to adjust the reins. The routine, with its small exchanges, strengthened their bond. Clara, looking at her hardened hands, knew that for the first time since Scorched Rock, she was part of something bigger than herself. Before sleeping, Clara watched the stars through the window, the rifle beside her, but without the previous tension. She thought about the change the cabin had brought, a place where silence was a companion, not a prison. Tom, as always, kept watch through the night, the knife nearby but with a softer gaze, as if the burden he carried was lighter with her presence. The young woman, lying on the tarp, dreamed of a desert in bloom, a sign that the wind, once an enemy, was now a lullaby. She woke with the morning light, bringing the certainty that this new life, harsh and simple, was hers by choice. The cowboy, preparing coffee, saw her smile upon waking, and for a moment allowed himself to share the relief, knowing that the cracked shelter had transformed them into something more, ready for whatever came next. Clara woke to the snort of Sombra outside, the dawn sun tinting the desert with golden tones that filtered through the patched window of the cabin. The fresh morning air carried the scent of damp earth after a light night rain. The young woman, with the rifle at her side and the blanket folded over the tarp, felt her body strong after weeks of work. Her brown hair, now braided by her own hands, framed green eyes that reflected a peace she hadn't known before. Tom, already up, was adjusting the horse's reins, the grey cloak on his shoulders, the black hat tilted as he checked the saddlebags. The silence between them was deeper, but also more comfortable, a decision made without needing words. Clara stood, stored the rifle carefully, and approached, feeling that the cracked shelter, now a home, was about to be left behind. The wind whispered a farewell that filled her with expectation. Without exchanging glances, Both knew it was time to leave. Tom mounted Sombra, extending his hand to help Clara climb up behind him. She, with a movement now practiced, settled in, holding tightly to his waist. The blanket rolled like a shield against the wind. The horse began to trot, leaving the cabin behind. The reinforced walls faded into the distance, and Clara looked back one last time, knowing that place marked the end of a flight and the beginning of something new. The desert opened before them, vast and without carved paths, like an invitation. Tom guided with his usual calm, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if knowing that the destination didn't matter as much as the direction. Clara, feeling the sway of the animal, understood that the silence was not emptiness but belonging, one that required no promises, only presence. The journey continued for hours. The sun rose, heating the sand. Clara watched as the terrain changed, greener shrubs, signs of water in the distance. Tom adjusted the route by instinct, stopping only so Sombra could rest beside a small oasis. The young woman dismounted and helped fill the canteen. At the spring, she noticed that he let her take the initiative, a gesture of respect that made her feel part of the journey, not just a passenger. They ate roots they had brought from the cabin, sharing the meal in silence. Clara, watching the cowboy, saw in his scars a reflection of her own marks, an understanding that needed no explanation. That oasis, with its clear waters and cool shadows, was a pause, but both knew it wasn't the destination. The road called them beyond. The sunset painted the sky with vivid colors. Clara, once again mounted behind Tom, felt the wind as a companion, not a threat. The sound of hooves mixed with the distant song of birds. He stopped on a rise, dismounted to observe the horizon. She followed him, her eyes following his, discovering a green field that opened up in the distance, a promise of life beyond the desert. "I think it's that way," Clara said, breaking the silence. Tom nodded, as if her voice guided just as well as his. They mounted again. Sombra advanced, carrying them toward the unknown. The bond between them was stronger than anything, a tie forged in struggle, in labor, and in the decision to walk together. Night fell under a starry sky. Clara and Tom rode side by side. Sombra's trot was slow. The silence between them was deeper than ever, but full of meaning. Clara didn't know where they were going, and he didn't seem to have a fixed plan, but what bound them was stronger than any map. It was a sense of belonging that transcended the desert, a direction chosen by two survivors who had found each other. The young woman, the blanket over her shoulders, looked at the stars, feeling that the open horizon was hers, a future without chains, built step by step. Tom, guiding Sombra, felt the same. The sound of the wind, once howling as a warning, was now a melody accompanying them, leading them toward a destination they didn't need to name. Did you enjoy following Clara and Tomas's journey to this thrilling end? Then don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for joining us on this adventure full of struggle, trust, and new beginnings. Tell us in the comments what you thought of the ending and where you're watching from. You're incredible.